This session is actually supposed to be quite open-ended. The topic for discussion is really how should we move forward? Hopefully we've made a bit of a start with this paper, but we recognize that it's really only a beginning of an attempt to answer some of the questions we might have around the design of anti-corruption institutions. So at least for me, the overarching research question here is, what can we say about the design of anti-corruption institutions? Maybe the normative question, how should they be designed, if you want to put it that way? And I think the discussion so far, a lot of the discussion so far has been very helpful in helping us to identify the possibilities. Right? So what are the possible models? What models are out there already in various countries or have existed at various times? And then also, as a theoretical matter, or as a conceptual matter, well, what could be done, right? And that's obviously very important and useful. But I think it would be helpful today, or for the rest of the session, to also think about how we should go about evaluating the various options, the various models, right? So that involves, first of all, the question of, well, what are the criteria? We suggested a few criteria in our paper. They were the legitimacy, fairness, legality, and efficiency. And it would be very helpful, at least for us, to have comments on whether or not those are the right criteria, whether we should narrow the list or even expand the list. I have to say that I don't think it would be productive to spend too much time thinking about the precise definitions of legitimacy and fairness and so forth. Adrian and I, the last time we met, were at a conference where people spent days talking about the definition of legitimacy. So we understand that there's a lot to be fleshed out there. But really just thinking about, well, what should we be trying to accomplish in the design of anti-corruption institutions? So that's, or what should we be hoping for in the evolution of anti-corruption institutions, if you want to think about it that way. So that's one set of questions. But then, now speaking for myself, there's also the question of how we should go about evaluating performance empirically, right? What does that involve? How do we tell whether this is working or one model is better or worse? What sort of data would we need to collect? This is a bit of an obsession of mine because in my other academic work, I spend a lot of time thinking about how to go about measuring the performance of legal institutions. And certainly part of it involves collecting data about just the law in the books, the basic legal norms. And we've taken a stab at doing that, and I think the lawyers in the room understand it's a difficult task across multiple jurisdictions, but we have a fairly good sense of how to do that. What's more difficult is to collect data on the institutions that administer the law, right? Not the people, and also the formal structures, the rules that govern those organizations, right? And we've taken a stab at doing that in this paper and in this project, but I'm sure that there's a lot more work that could be done, especially on the sociological side. It's important to know who these people are and what sort of things they talk about and how they communicate with one another. And so maybe thinking about that, how do you do research on these kinds of institutions is important. And then finally, something we haven't done at all in this project, but down the road I'm sure other people will be interested in doing it, is evaluating the impact of any given set of anti-corruption arrangements out there in the world, right? How are they perceived in terms of their legitimacy, their fairness, and what sort of effects do they have on behavior, right? In particular, the incidence of corruption. So hopefully, as we go through the rest of this session, we can start to think about some of these questions in addition to the kinds of topics we've been talking about so far. So with that, the floor is essentially open. We do not have a very rigid structure for this session. I'm hoping that we can hear from everyone. It'd be great to have a sense of your reactions to the day as a whole, but we don't have to do that in any particular order. So for now, I will simply open the floor and comments on the question of how to go forward.
Can I start? So I wanted to have some opportunity to tell you about a project I've been involved with for the past 3 years that is a little similar to yours, which then might suggest some ideas. So the EU and a little bit of funding from the Greek government went to a 3-year study that was proposed by a group at the University of Aristotle University at Thessaloniki. And there's about a 10-person group there that's been working pretty much full-time on this for 3 years, and their proposal was to come up with an extremely detailed proposal that could be implemented by the government that would cover everything from substantive criminal law to procedural arrangements that would make Greece more effective in prosecuting corruption and financial crime, or responding to the problems of corruption and financial crime. So that would include prophylactic regulation as well as criminal prosecution when that was not successful. So they started out with sort of a similar objective, and the design of their program was to have experts from 5 countries that they thought offered different and effective, relatively effective models. I'm the US expert. There are experts from the UK, from France, from Germany, and from Sweden. And the way they used us, so again, they're working in a different direction. They're saying, where are effective models and what is effective about those effective models? So the first stage was very intensive interviewing within Greece of judges, prosecutors, people in agencies, and so forth, to identify what they thought were their problems. I think they knew they had problems, but they wanted to get a better sense of how the system was actually operating, not just on paper, right? Actually operating, what were perceived as the bottlenecks and the frustrations, you know, what was ineffective, what was effective. And they thought about all of the issues, and we received a questionnaire that, I used the word shock earlier today, was shockingly extensive. As a non-member of the EU, I was not obliged to answer some of the questions, but I can tell you that as the non-member of the EU, there were 146 extremely detailed questions. My response was 165 pages with 1,300 footnotes, right? And all of the other experts produced these very detailed. So I was talking about the GAO and the Office of Government Ethics and the Inspectors General and, you know, so on and so forth. Double jeopardy, whatever, all of these issues. And they received these country reports. And then we met for a week in Thessaloniki going through the different topics. When, you know, why is this the way you do this? Why is that the way you do that? Then we left, the team of 10, to continue processing and thinking. Their next stage then was to send small outreach teams out to each country. So 3 came to the US for 2 weeks, and I had asked them to identify who they wanted to interview. So that's when we went to the World Bank. That's when we went to the IMF. That's when we went to the GAO, the Government Ethics Office, Public Integrity in DOJ, the Tax Division at IRS, and so on. And then I identified some private lawyers and so on. And then they came back to Durham because I thought they ought to see people from the U.S. Attorney's Office and so on, not just everything at Main Justice and the sort of nerve center. And they spent some time in the library and so on. So there, those, I guess, we're now coming close to the conclusion where we will all be going back either to Thessaloniki or Athens to then present and comment on and critique this report, which they fondly hope will have an influence. So it's not really sponsored by the government. It's not a government bureaucracy that's producing this report, but there will be an effort to bring in as many as possible of the senior leadership in Greece that might be influenced by this to try to get them to respond to and engage with this proposal. And I imagine that, of course, it would be modular in the sense that some of it could be adopted without all of the rest of it being adopted. And I think some things are still up for grabs. I've been pushing them to think about corporate criminal liability. They're very influenced by the German system. The senior professor who prepared the grant application, very hostile to corporate criminal liability. She trained in Germany. She just really not on board with this. And I would close by saying to Kevin that I think it's difficult to identify the work that corporate criminal liability does or needs to do. So I would say, if you wanted to think about the need for corporate criminal liability, you would want to think about whether any specific country had sufficiently robust alternatives, which could include, based on the American experience, punitive damages in civil cases, treble damage actions under something like RICO or the antitrust laws, class action, a robust class action system so that you could aggregate lots of civil plaintiffs, administrative regulations and administrative sanctions that are, how do they exist and how aggressively are they enforced. And at that point, you would then maybe view the prosecution of individuals, right, in this area. And if all of those are sufficiently robust, what you ought to see as the output is relatively low rates of criminality, right? Because one way or another, these various institutions, and you'd probably have things like FOIA, the Freedom of Information Act, and a very robust sort of First Amendment press, various civil society groups that would be aggressively watching environmental regulations or whatever. And all of that would produce the output that some group like Transparency International is trying to measure. How corrupt, or how bad is your air, or you're right, are your drugs safe and effective, whatever areas you thought would be influenced. When there's an earthquake, do your buildings fall down? In China, yes, maybe the, either the regulation is not sufficiently high of building codes, or it's not being enforced, it's being bought off, or they're lazy. And so I don't think you have to prove the case that it's essential because of the multiplicity argument. I think you want the most robust set of alternatives, and if you have a high enough level of various forms of criminality, what you do is you brighten the corner where you are. You pick up whatever things you are able to implement within your own system. So maybe it's easier to get class actions, maybe it's easy, right? So in the US, what you see is the Chamber of Commerce and other conservative groups, it's like what we would call whack-a-mole. They're trying to get rid of punitive damages, they're trying to narrow class actions, and they don't want regulation in the first instance. So they'll say, don't make all the 99 good companies do a lot of extra things, right? Right, just sanction the bad ones, but then they try to narrow the sanctioning mechanisms. I'm on the other side. Give me everything, right? Because I think corporations are increasingly powerful, and there are increasing opportunities for them to cause great harm, whether it's in corruption, whether it's in public health and safety, environmental, and I want the biggest toolkit possible, and then the flexibility, right, and multiplicity of those tools. And you may get an innovative prosecutor or administrator, or the states in the United States in the tobacco litigation, where they brought in the private lawyers, right, to help them do this multi-state litigation that finally brought the states to their knees on tobacco litigation. The insight was to bring in the private lawyers who take, I can't remember the word, take a piece of the action. Yes, contingency fee lawyers. They brought in the private contingency fee lawyers who worked with the states, and the states brought parallel action in each state court, right? And the image was stag hunting. When you have the pack of dogs, no one dog can bring down the stag, but the pack brought down the stag, right? So federal government ineffective regulation, individual plaintiff litigation, that tobacco companies spent millions of dollars making sure that every individual lawsuit dragged on forever, nobody ever won. If anybody got anything, they appealed it right away. And this innovative action by the states massing together was what worked. Well, that might not be the thing that would work in other areas. I would say, unless Transparency International, in your sense, is in your country, it's all great. We don't need to change anything. Then I would say, what do other countries have that's working well? Could it be brought into our system, right? Can it be adapted in such a way that it would be accepted and you would be able to implement it in the system? And if so, I don't think the burden of proof needs to be that high. All right? So I would say that you could also be successfully looking out and perhaps narrow the burden of proof for what might be desirable alternatives that could be considered in different countries. And the barriers may be lower for adoption for some things rather than others.
Hi, thank you. Before I give some suggestions, and I have more, I think, additional questions and suggestions. First, thank you very much for the past couple of days. It's been very rich discussions. And IDRC, we've been funding this research over 2 years, 2.5 years. It's a much larger project. And I actually hadn't been able to interact in person with the heads, and I'm remiss that I hadn't been here sooner, but I'm happy that I was able to come down. And it's a very rich set of discussions we've had from many perspectives, both practical and more conceptual. And so I think that I'm really interested actually to hear more of some of the thoughts of ideas. So to give a bit of bigger context, I manage a series of research projects on law and development issues, mostly in Africa and also in Latin America. And it's all kind of, a lot of it's coalesced around issues of regulatory institutions, administrative institutions. And I mean, I really came at it from an access to justice perspective, looking at the people who were the most vulnerable. I'm a human rights lawyer by background, so I had that framework, who's most vulnerable and have the biggest problems, and research is most amenable to that because you're looking at a longer term perspective than just coming in and trying to somehow solve problems through donor funding, which we can have larger discussions about that model of seeing the world. And so this is the only part that deals with anti-corruption, and I knew at some point to have some credibility, it has to be there because it cuts across so much. So I can think of many of the other issues we work on. Essentially, they can be reduced to questions of corruption, whether in delivering electricity in the slums in Nairobi, where we've had some successful interventions, or in land investments in Africa, and so on and so forth. So it's been very valuable. And so I'm also keen to think how can, keep working on some of these issues. And especially the group I work with it's called Governance, Security, and Justice. So on the governance and the justice side, for various reasons, we've had other focus. We haven't looked at questions as much as economic and political corruption, and I think it's very poignant. So, I mean, a couple of questions, and I have to maybe stimulate the debate. I mean, I'm always curious between issues of when is it research and when is evaluation, and what sort of value added can you have for research? I think this initial mapping and trying to organize issues is very good, and it speaks very much to the research side. Some of the issues that Kevin flagged in terms of measuring impact and stuff, how to make sure that's still research, because as Guillermo pointed out yesterday, in Paraguay with their 7 strategies, anti-corruption at a national level, I'm sure they're all measuring their impact and feeding up to their donors. But somehow, something strikes me it's probably not working, and it's probably, so I think that's one thing is how to both be practical at the same time trying to be conceptual, because, and then that's also about really who are your audiences, and that's something we always keen. I think it's, it seems you've struck a balance, and then how to also keeping a balance between, on the one hand, being able to have the space to academically hash out the conceptual issues, and we can go back to issues of double jeopardy or natural justice, which may be a bit, may seem abstract in this context where so many other steps need to be gotten to first, but on the other hand, it's forward thinking, but then how to make sure that it speaks to policymakers. And this is our existential question: how do you take research and turn it into policy? But then, especially on these issues where there's so much movement, and I think people are implementing projects and programs, and so part of that's local policymakers and part of it's funders. And so, I mean, I think it's also thinking about how to reach them, and then how to have really some kind of recommendations that goes a bit more grounded but than maybe just the conceptual. And I'm not trying to say one's more important than the other, but how are you combining them and then translating it into a language where you're reaching them. So maybe you are actually talking about impact evaluation, but at the same time approaching it from a research perspective. I don't have the answer, and it's very context specific and issue specific, but those are just sort of parameters. That's how we think around sort of research like this, which is really answering very important questions, and you want to give space and time for people to do it, but also trying to understand what's the sort of why of all this. So, thank you again.
Could I jump in? So, sort of piggybacking on this, and I mean, I hear a lot of things here, and I'm a political scientist, and so I may be hearing things that are very different from what everybody else is hearing. But when Kevin, and they may be worse, but when Kevin asked about measurement, and then hearing people who spoke before me, you know, I think that measurement is impossible in this field. I don't mean to dash your hopes or anything. I just think it doesn't take us anywhere. But I think that you've already taken a really big step forward just describing these systems. And maybe the next step, which I think would be very useful, it's not quantitative, but it's qualitative, would be to measure the bottlenecks, to look at the bottlenecks, and to think about the bottlenecks in these systems. And I like Sarah's perspective of let 1,000 flowers bloom, you know.
I almost used that phrase.
Really? Okay, so try everything and see what works. But then, you know, I think one of the very nice things about the past few days was hearing practitioners talk about their experiences, hear, you know, how institutions work or don't work. We think institutions work, but then when you look at how they actually work in their context, it's not quite what you expected. And so rather than measure, I would evaluate, and I would evaluate drawing heavily on the practitioners. And I had gone ahead this morning and thought about some of the things that I would say as you know, in response to the question here, what kind of research do we need? And I would just go one step further and say, one thing that came across to me, and you'll all look at me strangely and say he's a political scientist, but one of the things that came across very clearly to me in the past few days is the importance of the civil service, the importance of the bureaucracy within these networks. And I thought of some of the reasons why this is important, and the past few days helped me to sort of systematize this a little bit more. It's not at all systematic, but it's better than what it was yesterday. And the importance of the civil service within these institutional networks to push back against political pressure. In development these days, we have this sort of word that's in vogue of resilience. And bureaucracy, I think, when there is capacity, bureaucracy provides resilience to these systems. Bureaucracy, we've talked a little bit about the role of the civil service in learning from crisis and being able to translate crisis into, or scandal, or whatever the case may be, into something that is an effective improvement in the system. I heard in Manuel's talk this morning that, in a sense, practitioners within the system, they may be civil servants, they may be political actors, but practitioners within the system are the people who really find the bridges between institutional structures and effective policy. And you know, they're the ones who make it work or not. But they're the ones who take the big ideas and then put them into practice and, again, find where the bottlenecks are and find what needs to be made better. And at its best, civil service, I think, contributes to something that Guy made the point about yesterday, which is when it's working well, civil service contributes to strategic coordination and to thinking about the big issues and then to translating that into effective policy and strategy. And the case that we've spoken a lot about is the ENCLA, where I think Roberto's point yesterday was a very good one about the difference between government policy and state policy. And bureaucracy to me, or civil servants to me, seem like the link that makes these strategic goals into state policy rather than government policy. And so I don't know. I realize that you don't have all the time in the world, but if I were in your shoes, I might say maybe it's worth going in and looking, rather than trying to measure outcomes, but actually look at what practitioners are saying about how the system works, and doing that a little. I know you've done it, but go deeper into that to try to figure out where the bottlenecks are. And then going back to the point that I made yesterday, doing some comparison here. And I think that you've got the basic framework of comparison, but you really don't have the meat of the comparison yet. And so that meat could come from looking at the comparative bottlenecks in these systems. Another way to look at this, and we discussed this again yesterday, was what explains coordination in these systems. And I would push you to do that a little bit more. Guy gave us the framework yesterday of hierarchy and markets and networks and norms. And I'll end on this last point. I think of all of those coordination mechanisms, the one that I hear is the most important is one that you all called education. But really what education means, and I may be pushing what you meant, but what education really means is creating common norms and common mentalities that reach across professional boundaries. And so coordination at its best is really trying to create a common language and a common strategy that unifies people who come from, juridical fields, who come from, more accounting or whatever the case may be. But that would be the overall. Okay.
Matthew, just on that last point, thank you for all of them, but just on the last one, I was wondering how you feel about the term education, because we've been struggling with that.
I don't like it.
Yeah. And so at one point we were saying orientation, formation, So any thoughts on the right term would be
I don't have a substitute, but I don't like it. But, I'll let Guy give you a better one.
No, I'm not sure I have a better one, but I think, okay, let's get the other political scientists out of the way and go on. One thing that's really struck me in all this is how different legal scholarship is from social sciences, political science, organization theory. And so that things that I think are basic to one really seem to be missing in the other. And so let me just make a couple of points based on that. A couple of things I think are important is to think about the instruments for essentially implementing anti-corruption. Again, and implementing coordination. Now, there's a huge literature on policy instruments. Chris Hood began this with, and just this word, the fact that Sarah used a moment ago, the toolkit of government. And so, and one of the toolkit, what he calls nodality, which I think is even worse than education. But essentially, government is an information node, both in terms of receiving information from society and diffusing information. So if you can govern through information, it's the cheapest way in which you can govern. So to the extent that then you can use the diffusion of ideas, information, norms to govern, very cheap and effective, typically. So another person called it sermons. Essentially, government had three tools: carrots, sticks, and sermons. But again, to think about this in design terms. And I would recommend, there's a wonderful little article by a Canadian, Rod MacDonald, classic Canadian name, but Rod MacDonald called it the Swiss Army knife of governance. And what he was really looking at, the Swiss Army knife comes in various varieties.
It's toolkit in one.
Yeah, but do you have the right tools? And do you have too many tools? So sometimes you may simply need the blade and nothing else. But if you've got one version of the Swiss Army knife, you don't have a bottle opener. So if you're in the top of the Alps and want to open a bottle of beer, you're out of trouble. You're out of luck. So essentially then, to think about then designing around particular sets of instruments. And a lot of what he sort of is the backward version of design, i.e. all the things that can go wrong in design. And it's really a good sort of primer for thinking about designing from what to avoid rather than perhaps what to do. So it's not really sort of normative in the sense of what to do, but it certainly is in terms of what to avoid. And from that, again, I think to some extent, to pick up on the point that Matt was making, you can think then about the contingencies. I think there's always a danger of thinking about institutional design and so forth as one size fits all. And what you really need to do is think about the contingencies. And those contingencies then become important for the design of the system, but then they also become important for the comparative analysis. And like my distinguished colleague on the left here, I do think you can measure. It may not be in terms of, you're not going to deal essentially with interval level measurement or ratio level, but you can deal with essentially ordinal or certainly nominal levels of measurement. So you can get to some ideas where you can say some things are better or higher or lower, or some things work or seem to work and they don't. And then what contingencies are associated with that. And again, the social sciences have been developing some really powerful methodological tools to use that type of essentially nominal levels of measurement to try to extract lessons. Typically parades under the banner of qualitative comparative analysis, QCA. And so there you can take case studies and aggregate them, and then really develop some notions about the patterns that exist within them. And again, it's not perfect, but it gives you, I think, some really powerful ways of getting at bringing together some of the cases, because you've got some nice cases. And you also then find things that look sensible, or you think are sensible, that may not work. For example, with all due respect, size. Because you go to the Baltics, and probably the smallest of the Baltic countries, Estonia, has this huge, it's only 1.5 million people, seems to have one institution per person for dealing with government accountability. So, and whereas you take essentially the largest of the Baltic cases, Sweden, has one. So here's something you can dismiss, at least on that basis. So this is what you can do. You get to essentially sort things out. So I think you can measure, again, not perfectly, and there's a lot of stuff in the literature from organizational theorists, social policy people, et cetera, who deal with measurement of coordination. And with due respect to, I think it was Sarah who said this, I think you really have to be careful about assuming you can take an institution from one society or culture and transplant it into another. There's a very large literature on diffusion of innovations, diffusion of policy. And you found that many policy instruments are very culturally embedded, that you can't necessarily just pick them up and move them. There's a wonderful story when BART was being built in San Francisco. So the planners who were doing BART hopped on a plane, flew to Munich, said Munich had this wonderful public transportation system. We'll have it. Thank you very much. Hopped back on the plane and tried to implement the Munich transportation system, failing to note that San Francisco has this big body of water. It's sort of in the middle of Munich didn't. And likewise, population density is much higher, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So even some very basic geographical points they didn't understand, much less the cultural differences. Moving things around is not as easy as we'd like to think. So, thanks.
Just one remark. The differences between legal scholarship and the political science scholarship may not be as dramatic as you think. And you may be thinking that, I think, because this piece we didn't see as the comparative analysis itself. It's more the sort of framing of it and so forth.
Okay.
But for example, Rod MacDonald was actually a legal scholar. He passed away recently, and so I hadn't read that piece of his, but he was, at McGill Law School. And yes, the methodological challenges here will be significant, though, in doing a proper comparison. Jed, I think.
So us also, as a skeptic on the transplantability issue, one of the things I was thinking about in the context of both, not just sort of evaluation, but also in selection, this move that Mariana was talking about between the intellectual debate and then the implementation. I think there's a really big gulf between conceptualizing corruption episodically or institutionally, systemically, and especially at how different countries think about what their particular problem is vis-a-vis corruption, right? So we can have this very difference. Is the U.S. corrupt, right? Well, we've conceptualized certain types of things as not corrupt that, for example, this always happens in the Chinese-U.S. context. Campaign finance reform. We have completely institutionalized corruption, right, from their point of view. They have different things. So I think when it comes to this move of like indigenizing whatever type of general knowledge we put, I think some sort of evaluation or developing a typology about how this particular society conceptualizes their corruption problem, and then both that leads to what would be more likely to be able to get policymakers or people of influence in that country to implement, and then that would lead to some sort of measurement, right? So we could have sort of a lot of legal mechanisms that could facilitate episodic sort of success in prosecuting corruption cases when you have them, right? Do we have is it a doctrinal issue, right? Is there some sort of institutional issue that stops a case from proceeding when we know that it is there, right? Or it is perceived as being there. Vis-a-vis, are we intervening, right? And this is, again, a lot of the corruption in the law and development context. Are we intervening in some sort of institutional logic, right? So it's like there are lots of things in countries where people know, right, okay, this is corruption, but this is part of how our particular political configuration allows things to sort of live right now. This is how de facto federalism, right, in China works, right? We know that it's technically corruption, but it's part of the logic of the system, so it's not a matter of what type of tool you have, right? We're not going to be able to intervene on that level. So I think distinguishing between this sort of like episodic versus institutional or logics of corruption allow you to both disaggregate the types of evaluative rubrics, that you're going to use for particular mechanisms in countries, but also in how you're going to indigenize these larger projects in these particular contexts, right? Because then you can actually go to people and say, like, look, well, this is like a huge issue in your society, but I know this is not going to be likely the subject of reform, right? Like the Brazilian court system, right? You're not going to be able to modify its particular issues, but they're institutional or doctrinal. So we're going to do this institutional bypass, right? And create some sort of other alternative that uses these mechanisms that more correlates with politically, right? What is generally seen as both being corruption, right, and something that we can sort of intervene. So maybe it's just on the episodic level. We're not going to be able to engage in things institutionally. So I think just that one sort of like typology of both instruments and what type of corruption they're engaging with, and then that can also then be used to reflect how are particular countries conceptualizing their corruption problems and what types of ways can you actually get that implemented once you've, have some sort of relevant research to sort of deploy in that context.
The honorary North American, Mariana.
Okay. So I think I have two sets of comments. One is on the qualitative analysis and cultural differences, right? I think these two could go together quite nicely. So let me just preface that by saying that there is a course that's available online. It's called Customs of the World, David Livermore. And he has a chapter where he differentiates cultures in which people value more rules and cultures in which people value more their relationships, right? And he says, and it's an very easy task that you can do in order to ascertain which culture you belong to. And we basically ask the person, you are in a car with a friend, your friend is over the speed limit, and he hits a person. You are the only witness, and the police is saying that if you testify that he or she was over the speed limit, he or she will be sanctioned. Would you testify against your friend? And basically, you can see clearly how this goes, right? The rule-based cultures say, of course, that he or she was over the speed limit, needs to testify. There are no questions. The other side is, no, of course not. It's my friend. How can I possibly testify against a friend? So these are the two extremes. If you're asking yourselves, did the person die? You are somewhere in the middle, right? You're trying to contextualize in order to say, it depends, I would or I would not, but you're certainly not all the way to the side of rule-based cultures, right? So I think a lot of what we're talking about in terms of, I think, both Manuel's experience and I heard about what Roberto said yesterday, that in a number of countries, the cooperation happens because you have a friend on the other agency. agency, right? Because you can call the guy with whom you went to law school, right? And he's going to carry the thing forward. I think that's tied up with the idea that these are cultures in which if you create rules to say your institution needs to cooperate with that institution, that's not going to mean much, right? And therefore, we're going to need to design mechanisms of cooperation that are culturally adjusted, which means building these relationships. And then I think as institutional designers, we can do a lot of interesting stuff with this, because it might be that today both Manuel and Roberto are operating on totally ad hoc relationships, right? The relationship happened to be there for some reason. Well, so let's think creatively about how we can institutionally create these relationships, right? So I think, for instance, ENCLA is clearly a way in which you're creating relationships, right? ENCLA is the moment in which everybody comes together. So now Roberto knows he can call a guy. The guy knows who Roberto knows who the guy is, and ENCLA created a relationship. So it's not a formal mechanism, but an informal mechanism that's way more effective in a culture like the Brazilian one, which is not, it's sort of halfway in the middle, I would argue. So I think in that sense, the qualitative analysis can be quite interesting in terms of mapping which kind of culture we're dealing with, and then therefore which kind of mechanisms would be more effective. Now, on the measurement and therefore possibility of qualitative analysis, I would beg to differ from Matthew and side with Guy and say, I think there could be interesting things. I think there could be interesting things to do here. So just thinking out loud, right? So we do have the corruption perception index from Transparency International, which are not perfect, they're based on perception, but that's one index that we have. And we have indexes of number of people sanctioned versus number of people prosecuted and number of people investigated, right? And I think this is already data that we can sort of compile in order to say, you're pretty high on the Transparency International Perception Index, but you're pretty low on number of sanctions imposed vis-a-vis other countries, right? And you can do like sanctions per capita in order to capture the size of population. And once you have done that, I think the idea of modularity or multiplicity could kick in here, because we could do some sort of interesting analysis by saying how much levels of modularity within a country, right? Higher modularity, lower modularity, or multiplicity, higher multiplicity, lower multiplicity. So the US would clearly be a high multiplicity country. Brazil would clearly be, I think, a little bit lower, and we can think of countries in which, like, there isn't civil investigation, there is no option of civil punishment, right? So the multiplicity would be even lower. And then try to see whether the level of multiplicity correlates with higher or lower sanctions, being the sanctioning proportional to your ranking on the Transparency International Index, right? So I think that could be, for instance, one interesting piece of research. I'm just throwing out there. Of course, there's going to be a lot of problems that we need to work out, but I think that's I think you get the bottom line, and just one. I think two other points. I think there is also potential for a very interesting theoretical debate, and I just heard that Guy perhaps talked about this yesterday, but I wasn't here, unfortunately, for your panel. But it's exactly on the idea of hierarchy in markets, right, which lends itself to the theory of the firm, and this very interesting discussion about when firms internalize transaction costs, when they keep doing contracts with other firms, which I think it's a very, very interesting theoretical framework for us to analyze when do you create an anti-corruption agency, right? We could create the theory of the anti-corruption agency, which is when do we internalize everything within a specialized body? When do you leave for the markets to operate with all these bodies and the transaction costs that will play out in them articulating there? So I think there is a potential model for us to start off in order to, one, generate a theory of when would be predictable that the anti-corruption agency would be created or not, and then the case studies could test the hypothesis, right? So I think that would be an interesting investigation. And last but not least, and I think this is more for the political scientists, I think it would be fascinating to do a study of whether there is some kind of correlation between the effectiveness of the enforcement system, so the oversight, investigation, punishment, and the robustness of the legislation. Yes, exactly. So my idea would be the following, and I think you guys touch upon this on the paper in one little paragraph, but you're talking more about the anti-corruption agency, but the legislator has this double incentive, right? One incentive the legislator has is, I'm going to increase legislation because that looks good politically, right? I'm going to run for office and say, run for re-election and say, pass this legislation anti-corruption. At the same time, in a country with high level of corruption, the same politician might be looking at that and going, oh, no, I'm not going to approve that legislation because that can turn back against me and I will be prosecuted, right? So that dilemma is much reduced if the enforcement system is weak, right? Which would lend itself to potentially a prediction that countries in which the enforcement system is extremely weak would have very, very robust legislation. And I think Brazil is a very good example. Our legislation is beautiful, right? You look at the amount of statutes we have, sanctions, studies showing we're a model other developing countries should copy. So you go and say why the Brazilian legislator is doing this? Well, because they're 100% sure that there won't be enforcement on the other side, right? So there is no dilemma. You can claim the benefits of passing the legislation without incurring the cost of facing the risks. So I think that would be an interesting research. And I'm going to stop here. Thanks.
Sí, algunas ideas un poco para apoyar lo que acaba de decir Mariana. En el derecho penal hace tiempo que acuñamos el término de legislación simbólica. Es decir, cuando el legislador tiene un problema, los políticos tienen un problema y no saben cómo resolverlo, lo más fácil es hacer una ley, porque cuesta muy poco y dan la sensación de que se lo toman en serio. Y yo creo que esto es un peligro, ¿no? Porque degrada el valor de la ley, ¿eh? Es un problema tener demasiadas leyes que no se aplican, porque cuando viene una nueva reforma es la enésima reforma y ya nadie toma en serio esto, ¿no? Entonces, yo creo que hay que tener muy presente que quizás lo mejor es no hacer nada, ¿eh? A veces no hacer nada o pensar que efectivamente las legislaciones que tenemos están bien y no está el problema en la ley. Esto es lo más sencillo de cambiar. En relación a lo que decía también muy interesante de la importancia de las relaciones personales en la cooperación, os voy a poner un ejemplo. Cuando en la Unión Europea empieza a crear el espacio judicial europeo, se ve que una de las dificultades es cómo va a cooperar un juez español con otro juez de Alemania o de Suecia. Si esto es muy difícil, no se conocen, ¿no? Entonces, se ocurre hacer algo que es la red judicial europea, que es algo muy sencillo, que en España haya un representante de los jueces suecos y que en Suecia haya un representante de los jueces españoles. Entonces, el juez español que quiere colaborar con Suecia no tiene por qué hablar con un sueco que no le conoce, sino que llama a su colega español. Y ya su colega español, que ha ido desarrollando una red de contactos personales con los jueces suecos, pues ya habla con ellos, ¿no? Y esto agilizó mucho la cooperación, ¿no? Otras cosas que se hicieron también muy interesante fue, por ejemplo, no sé si han oído hablar de la orden de detención europea. La orden de detención europea es el mecanismo que entre nosotros, digamos que sustituye a la extradición. No tenemos extradición, sino un sistema de entrega mucho más sencillo dentro de la cooperación judicial. ¿Por qué ha triunfado? Porque en la orden de detención europea después hay un formulario que es muy fácil de rellenar. Entonces, cualquier juez que quiere solicitar la entrega de una persona, su búsqueda, ¿no? mi entrega, solo tiene que casi con cruces rellenar ese formulario. Y este ha sido uno de los éxitos de la orden de detención europea. Es decir, que yo creo que hay que pensar en estas cosas en relación a la cooperación. Luego, quería apuntar algo que en realidad no tiene que ver nada con lo que se está discutiendo aquí. Es decir, yo en la investigación, lo dije el primer día, sigo echando en falta una mayor atención a los aspectos preventivos de la corrupción, a crear órganos no tanto encaminados a reactivos, encaminados a investigar y a sancionar la corrupción, sino a crear una cultura de la legalidad en la administración. Y estos órganos están apareciendo, existen ya desde hace mucho tiempo en muchos países. Pienso en la Comisión Nolan en el Reino Unido, pienso, decía ayer, el ejemplo de Italia. Y claro, en el diseño institucional tenemos que tener en cuenta que quizás no sea buena idea unir estos órganos preventivos con los órganos represivos. La prevención tiene una lógica distinta a la reacción. El órgano preventivo que quiere diseñar políticas preventivas tiene que crear un clima de confianza con, en este caso, las administraciones públicas, que le cuenten de verdad dónde están sus problemas de cumplimiento, de por qué les es tan difícil cumplir la ley, tanto a las empresas como a los funcionarios públicos. Es decir, el problema de la corrupción, donde está institucionalizada, es que no es sencilla de saltársela. Es que no es una cosa naif que decir, no pagues sobornos y ya está. Es decir, las empresas se juegan puestos de trabajo, se juegan negocio y tienen un problema serio. Y en las administraciones públicas pasa igual. Si no se crea una cultura ética, si no se incide ahí, yo creo que no se avanza demasiado, por más que nos empeñemos en los aspectos más reactivos, más de investigación y sanción. Y yo creo que es importante diseñar ese tipo de órganos. Y luego algo que yo también veo en algunos países, por ejemplo, se está empezando a ver en España, es cómo combinar este tipo de órganos, instituciones en materia de corrupción, con aquellos que nacen en materia de transparencia, que es otra de las grandes palabras, las legislaciones sobre transparencia, que a veces se confunde la transparencia con la lucha contra la corrupción, y son cosas distintas. La transparencia ayuda a que haya menos corrupción, pero es un fin en sí mismo. Pero hay un cierto solapamiento, yo veo, y confusión a veces también entre los políticos, entre los órganos de transparencia y las políticas anticorrupción. Y también pasa lo mismo con las cuestiones de conflictos de intereses, ¿no? El intentar evitar las revolving doors, ¿no? El paso de la política a la administración, etcétera. También a veces los órganos que hacen esto hay que coordinarlos, tienen que encontrar su papel, pero a veces también se les puede hacer asumir competencias en materia de corrupción, pues que van más allá de sus funciones, ¿no? Y estos no los he visto citados, ¿no? en la corrupción. Hay países como México, ¿no? Por ejemplo, donde la transparencia incluye bastante a la corrupción, en lo que he visto. Esto es lo que quería apuntar.
¿Puedo adicionar una cosa? Just while people are thinking of their questions and comments. One thing that we haven't talked about, Michael Johnson does a lot of work on corruption. He's got a great book on syndromes of corruption. And this, I guess, I don't want to fight back against the measurement people, and I kind of agree that QCA would be an interesting path. But I think that if you do measurement, you have to be careful that you're measuring the same thing, and this may also be what you were saying. And you know, his book on syndromes of corruption is essentially saying corruption is very different in every country. And I don't know if the differences are as big in the 6 cases that you discuss as they might be if you were comparing China, Brazil, Russia, and India. But I suspect that they are fairly large. And that's, I think, an argument sure, do the qualitative analysis, but it may also be an argument for going back down into talking to the civil servants and thinking about bottlenecks. And I'm sorry, I'm going to keep putting that out there, but someday it'll float.
You know, I wanted to respond to this idea that education is kind of a dirty word and that it's going to be difficult to get people to go along with education. You know, there's carrots in the world, right? And if the education is done at a place that's really nice, right, and people want to go there, right, and they get time off from their basic work and then they get some kind of certification or bonus, if they have gone through additional training, it could be regarded as prestigious or even almost a boondoggle to be able to go and do that. So that led me to, pardon me?
It could be corrupt.
Well, you know, not if they actually learn something. And that led me to something that I was told years ago, that you could look at the salaries of police departments in the United States and pretty readily predict which ones were going to be more corrupt, because those that were paid very poorly, where people couldn't support their families, it just, you know, you just had a recipe for people learning how to, shall we say, supplement their income, right? So not only would they take free food everywhere they went, but then you could pay them off to not come by at a certain time of day. So there are probably some really simple things in here that would predict how people within a bureaucracy are going to behave. Will they be eager to get additional training? Will they be relatively resistant to very, you know, sort of explicit kinds of bribes? You know, so is it Hong Kong where the judges are paid $1 million a year? It's Hong Kong or Singapore? Singapore. You know, on the theory that, you know, you just pay them enough, they won't be so tempted to take bribes. Now, I don't think we're talking about paying all of the civil servants in Argentina $1 million a year. That's really not feasible. But you know what? If you don't pay them enough to live on, I don't care what you design elsewhere. You know, they will, some substantial percentage of them will do what they need to do to support themselves and their families. So I agree completely that you can't just wholesale transport things from one system to another, but studying systems that work and asking why they work and asking if you have a gap somewhere where there are some institutions that could become options, right, or approaches that could become options. That seems to me really what you're doing within the 5, 6 countries. And I guess all I was suggesting is there's a big world out there where there aren't as many problems, and there might be some things on the list in those places. The other thing that I meant to suggest was, may I give your report to the Thessaloniki group, and would you like to see their report? So talking about networks, how do we get the network of people who are thinking about South America to be in coordination with the people who are thinking about some of the EU countries, right? Because it's the same, but it's different. There could be potentially a lot of learning, right? And I think their report will be produced in English as well as Greek. I certainly hope so, because I know I can't read it and comment on it otherwise. And so I think there would be opportunities for collaboration. And some here at the table might know Maria Caiafa Gabaldi, who is the head, so maybe there are already some connections. So Ed knew her. He said, oh, that must be Maria's project. All right, so perhaps other people at the table knew about it, but I'm pretty sure they didn't know about your project. So hopefully that kind of collaboration would also be one of the things that you would want to do. And maybe you know about other projects that they don't know about, so once they found you, and then they would find other projects.
Bom dia a todos. Deixa eu só dar meus 3 pitacos aqui. Na questão de educação, eu acho que é mais do que essencial. A gente falou disso ontem. Estou falando, obviamente, da nossa experiência brasileira aqui. Como falar de corrupção para uma população que não sabe nem o que é o Estado, né? Então, como que a gente quer ter controle social se a pessoa não sabe nem para que ela está votando, né? Ela não sabe nem o que eu faço. Eu sou um servidor público, ela não sabe nem o que faz. Então, acho que o princípio basilar é dar o nivelamento de informações, né, para poder incrementar um controle social, incrementar a prevenção, que é essencial, né, porque se você tem um controle social, você tem prevenção. essa parceria público-privada, e aí foi muito bom ontem, quando alguém comentou, acho que foi o Matthew, quem é da sociedade civil que você quer participar, né? Porque só vão participar aqueles que estão engajados. Será que eles são os mais importantes? Eu quero todo mundo. Eu quero que o povo saiba o que é dinheiro público, para que ele serve, por que o orçamento é votado daquele jeito, por que está se construindo uma estrada, e por que houve um problema na construção, e possa cobrar isso. Então, a educação é essencial. Como chamar? Eu também tive dificuldade quando fui lá fazer, porque troca de informações. Não, mas está falando que informação de investigação? Não, não. É difundir informação mesmo. É que todo mundo tem acesso ao mesmo nível de informação. Então, o primeiro ponto é esse. Com relação à coordenação, a Mariana trouxe a questão da ENCLA, que eu acho que... Eu tentei trazer ontem alguns exemplos concretos do que foi produzido lá, mas eu acho que o grande ganho do que foi produzido lá foi pôr todo mundo sentado na mesma mesa, né? Essa integração, além da coordenação, quer dizer, primeiro houve uma integração, todo mundo sabendo, polícia, o que você faz mesmo? Onde é que eu te atrapalho, onde é que eu te ajudo? CGU, quando eu mando um ofício, eu estou mandando para o chefe do serviço de... Não, isso vai demorar 6 meses para chegar para o Francisco, que é o responsável, e ele está na outra área, não é? Então, essa troca de informações é excelente e começa a nascer um ambiente de confiança, que aí eu posso ter não é amizade, né? Porque não é todo mundo que eu trabalho que eu sou amigo, eu estudei com ele na faculdade, mas eu começo a desenvolver um ambiente de confiança. Será que eu posso abrir alguma informação sigilosa para essa pessoa? Será que ela é séria? E ali você começa a ver quem são as pessoas sérias, você começa a institucionalizar essa integração. Então, é extremamente relevante. E, por fim, o meu último pitaco não adianta criar 15 instituições, responsabilidade criminal, enfim, a efetividade da punição tem que ser clara, né? Isso que tem que ficar claro. Isso foi muito bem falado aqui. Nós temos muitas leis e elas não estão funcionando. E como fazer para ser efetiva? Para ser efetivo hoje, com a falta de recursos que existe, tem que priorizar, né? É até uma recomendação nova do GAFI, do FATF, né, que trata de lavagem de dinheiro, que é avaliação de risco. Todo mundo está fazendo isso, né? Nós precisamos avaliar onde estão nossos bottlenecks, onde estão nossos maiores riscos e usar os recursos poucos que nós temos para combater. Corrupção é um grande risco? Ótimo, então vamos priorizar o combate à corrupção. Se o Estado amanhã entender que é melhor a gente aumentar as forças de fiscalização, controle, persecução, aí todos os crimes vão poder ser igualmente combatidos. Mas, enquanto isso não acontece, se priorize quais são os crimes que causam mais dano social. Crie-se critérios objetivos para que você atue, para que o Estado atue. Não significa dizer que aqueles outros crimes vão ficar esquecidos, né? Vou dar só um exemplo aqui e juro que estou finalizando. A questão do combate a fraudes bancárias. A gente tinha tem por atribuição as fraudes bancárias contra a Caixa Econômica Federal. Então, entravam lá pela internet, entravam na conta de um cidadão, mandavam esse recurso para a conta de um outro cidadão, coisa de R$800, né, 300 e poucos dólares. Isso acontecia e acontece muito. Para cada caso se abria uma investigação, né? Qual é o ganho nisso? Nenhum. Ninguém descobriu ninguém, né? Aí você começou a aglomerar essas informações, aí você começou a ver padrões de repetição e você começou a atuar. E aí você começou a pegar grandes quadrilhas. Então, não é que você vai deixar esses crimes que, num primeiro momento, parecem menores e esquecidos, mas dá um devido tratamento. Enquanto que eu acho que uma fraude de 120 milhões, a gente tem que abrir uma investigação e ir para cima na hora. Então, eram esses os recados aí. Muito parabéns novamente. Espero que esse trabalho ande adiante, espero que o Brasil leia esse trabalho, espero que o cidadão um dia entenda o que significa esse trabalho para a gente poder melhorar aqui um pouco o nosso país. Obrigado.
Okay, I think just on the education point, I think when I read that, I thought of two very different things. I think one is sharing information, and there is the sharing of information. There is multiple levels, right? So there is telling the regular citizen what the public prosecutor's office does, right? They don't know. Ministério Público heard about it, have no idea what they do, right? So the regular guy walking on the street needs to know that. That's one level of sharing of information. The other level, which is the ENCLA level, is the police and CGU sitting at the table and saying, how can we streamline stuff? That's another level of sharing of information, right? And I would add that on top of that, there is education that's not necessarily sharing of information per se, but it's a little bit changing the culture. And I think the police that you brought, especially in Brazil, provides a very good example. So the Secretaria Nacional de Segurança Pública, SENASP, in Brasilia, basically has courses for police officers, right? And the police officers sign up for the courses, and these are courses that are, trying to change values, inculcate a series of new practices, et cetera, and et cetera. So I was doing research on police reform, and I went there to interview them. And specifically, I went to talk to the person teaching the human rights course for police officers. So this is a person who went to the same law school that I went, has no training in police force, and was hired by SENASP to teach human rights to the police officers. And she said that it took her 4 years to figure out how effectively teach the course. And she walked me through it by saying, I started by saying, you cannot kill potential criminals. They need to go through the due process. And she said she was eaten alive in the classroom, right? Like the reaction was, you don't know what you're talking about, you're not on the streets, you don't know what we're facing, you don't know the problems, blah, blah, blah. Then the second year, she did a different approach. She went through the historical overview of all the human rights treaties, how they came about, and how the entire international human rights systems was put in place, etc. She said that the police officers were the best students ever. By the end of the course, they knew by heart the dates, the provisions, everything. And then she came to the end of the course and asked them, how does that apply to your day-to-day? They said, it doesn't. But it's great. It's a great system. It doesn't apply, but it's a great system, right? So finally, now, she told me she came to the realization that she needs to start the course by asking the police officers, how does the human rights legislation apply to you, right? Because she's inverting the order. She's saying, you as a citizen operating as a police officer in a very dangerous environment, how would you be protected by the human rights legislation? And by starting with that discussion, meaning putting them as the actor that's benefiting from the system, she says she has been much more effective in making them value and realize how that applies to their day-to-day, right? So these are the police officers that are down in Rio de Janeiro working at the UPPs, right? Which is a project that's trying to reduce police violence in the state of Rio de Janeiro. But you can see how this is a type of education that's not sharing information. It's a change of mentality that is much, much harder than sharing of information. So it's a much more complex idea of education that I think needs to be captured by what you guys are analyzing. Thanks.
That's a great story.
Okay, that's a lot to think about. It's amazing how many different directions I think we're being pulled in right now. To look at different literatures, first of all, comparative public administration, comparative politics, the law and development literature in which I work, and in government by information. This is actually something I write about with another hat on. So to look at different countries, so the extent, to what extent should we be doing that? That's a terrific question. And this is why it's just so great to have all these different voices in the room. So we really appreciate you all taking the time to come and share your thoughts with us. One thing I think we should acknowledge, though, of course, is that there are other voices that we haven't heard from, many other voices. For me, one set that was conspicuous by its absence, except for perhaps when Carlos was here, the voices of the firms. So I have to admit that when, Sarah, you're saying, let's try everything, I'm just thinking like my defense lawyer friends, like my manager friends, and that's the last thing they want. They need some certainty. It's costly to comply with the dictates of lots of different you know, so and those are real, those are social costs in the end. Those, you know, so not to sound too Republican, but that costs jobs. At some point, regulation does cost jobs.
Creates jobs for lawyers.
It does create jobs for lawyers. This is true. So at some point, it would be good to solicit the views of the firms and on all of these issues. And of course, the other set of voices that have been absent are those of the other countries in our study even. So it turns out there's lots to hear about just from Brazil and Argentina, basically. But going forward, I think we'll definitely want to see what the reactions to all of this would be in Colombia and Peru and Bolivia and Paraguay, et cetera. So, so we're certainly looking forward to that. Anything to add?
No.
Okay, well, with that, I think we'll close this session and lunch.
Yes, yes. Bom, muito obrigada a todos e a todas. Foi um prazer enorme. Estaremos em contato com todos. Tem os nossos endereços para seguir nessa troca, nesse compartilhamento. Você não vai botar o fone? Já vai me escutar em português nessa altura do campeonato? Bom, então, muito obrigada a todos. Encerramos aqui.